Welcome. This is the third lecture in our Psychodynamic series. In the first two, we built the foundation, what psychodynamic therapy is, and how it's used along the range from supportive work to deeper uncovering work. Today, we take that foundation into one of the hardest settings there is, working with people who are dying. This comes from Emmanuel and Brody's chapter on psychodynamic therapy in the terminally ill. I want to say up front that this is heavy material. We'll be talking about death, grief, guilt, suicide, and trauma. That weight is part of the subject, not something to rush past. The whole promise of palliative medicine is to protect quality of life even when someone is seriously ill, and just as much the quality of their dying, which touches not only the patient, but everyone who loves them. So our question today is simple. What does psychodynamic thinking add to that? Here's where we're going. By the end, you should be able to do 6 things. Explain how moving back and forth between opposite feelings, we'll call this oscillation, helps a person come to terms with dying. See how people often think about death one way out loud and a very different way deep down, and how therapy traces those deeper images back to where they came from. Describe how holding on to people inside us, grieving, and leaving a legacy help a person find a real sense of continuity at the end of life. Then, recognize the warning signs: anxiety, depression, brittleness, guilt, and what the chapter calls psychic deadness, that tell you someone hasn't come to terms with dying. Know how to tell that therapy is working and how to combine this kind of talk therapy with medication and psychiatric care. And finally, this one is unusual for a clinical lecture, but it matters here. Think about your own relationship with death, because this chapter argues you can't help a patient face something you haven't started to face yourself. Hold on to that last one. We'll come back to it at the end. So why use a psychodynamic approach with dying patients at all? 3 reasons. First, facing death can actually bring something good alongside the loss. Coming to terms with dying can deepen a person's sense of meaning, help them get clear on what they value, and strengthen their ties to the next generation. The loss is real, but it's not the only thing that happens. Second, this isn't a stretch for the field. Death and loss were central to psychodynamic thinking from the start. The major thinkers cared deeply about mortality. One even argued that most of our unconscious mental life is spent responding, one way or another, to the fear of death. So bringing this lens to dying patients isn't new. It's coming home. Third, and very practically, it fits the time you actually have. Yes, classic psychodynamic therapy can run for years, but shorter, lighter versions work beautifully with palliative patients where time is limited, and the longer, deeper work may be a good fit for family members, who often have more time than the patient does. So don't picture a multi-year analysis and assume it doesn't apply. This scales to whatever time you've got. This is the heart of the chapter, so let's slow down. Death creates a strange, one-of-a-kind kind of distress. On one side, the mind literally can't picture not existing. The best it can do is imagine erasure or absence, and even those need existence to make sense. On the other side, the fantasy that we'll somehow live forever doesn't hold up either. Some part of us knows it isn't true. So we're stuck between 2 impossible ideas. And the way people handle that is to swing back and forth between them. That swinging back and forth is what the chapter calls oscillation. Here's the key point. It's what comes out of that back and forth that matters, not either side on its own. What's interesting is that every school of psychodynamic thought describes the same swing, just in its own words. Drive theory calls it a conflict between drives. Object relations, the theory about our inner images of people, calls it swinging between feeling merged with someone and feeling separate. Winnicott describes it as the dread of falling apart versus the relief of being held. Bion describes raw, unprocessed feelings versus having a caring figure who helps you make sense of them. The developmental view calls it sliding between a less grown-up state of mind and a more grown-up one. Different words, same motion. Palliative patients move back and forth in how aware they are of their prognosis. One moment they know they're dying, the next they're talking about next year. That's not denial you need to correct. That swing is what lets a person bear the truth a little at a time while they adjust to it. So our job isn't to pin them to one fixed truth, it's to allow the swing and gently work with it. The swinging back and forth by itself isn't enough. What matters is whether it's actually getting somewhere. If a person swings and swings but nothing changes, that's just spinning in place. The chapter calls it repetition compulsion, going around the same loop over and over with no new understanding. A healthy process looks different. It still swings, but each pass forward moves things a little, a bit more understanding, a bit more settled. Think of it as a spiral moving forward rather than a circle stuck in place. That difference, going somewhere versus just spinning, is how you tell real progress from getting stuck. So how does the therapist actually tune into this? Within a calm, steady relationship, the tradition calls it offering evenly hovering attention and holding, which just means paying open, patient attention and being a steady presence. The therapist picks up clues from a lot of places at once. What the patient says when they talk freely, their dreams and daydreams, their slips of the tongue, the feelings the patient stirs up in the room, and the feelings the therapist notices in themselves, their moods, what their body is saying, the defenses they lean on, and how they handle the actual events of being ill. No single clue settles it. The therapist reads them all together to understand where this person is stuck and which old coping habits aren't helping anymore. This figure is the chapter's master diagram, and it pulls everything together. Read it as a journey from one side to the other, from a mind that's raw and scattered toward a mind that's settled and whole. That journey is what the chapter means by existential maturation, which is really just a fancy way of saying growing into a more peaceful relationship with death. The same journey is shown through 6 different theories stacked on top of each other: Freud's, Klein's, Winnicott's, Bayon's, the developmental view, and Kohut's. Each one names the same inner struggle in its own language: anger versus love, seeing the world in all or nothing terms versus seeing it whole, falling apart versus being held, raw sensations versus feelings you can actually make sense of, clinging dependence versus standing on your own, and an empty sense of self versus a puffed up one. The figure also lays out what helps a person make that journey: a safe, steady relationship, naming the different images of death they carry, finding usable ways to think about dying, and finding hopeful ways to do the work of dying, like leaving a legacy. Then it shows the roadblocks: trouble grieving, a harsh inner critic, complicated relationships, difficulty handling strong feelings, and trauma. And finally, the goal: a mind where death is no longer a terror, but something understood, accepted, and woven in, a sense that everything is temporary, that connection continues through the people we carry inside us, and that we belong somewhere in the bigger picture. Here's something really useful to know. People often think about death one way out loud and a completely different way deep down, and the gap can genuinely surprise the patient themselves. The mind tries to make sense of everything, including death, but it keeps running into that problem we talked about. It can't actually picture not existing. So on the surface, a patient may tell you, and truly mean it, death is just nothingness, or I've made my peace, or I'm not afraid. But their dreams, their daydreams, the way their body reacts, those point to something different underneath. Down there, death might be pictured as going home, or being embraced, or finally being complete, or as something agonizing, or as crossing into some other kind of existence entirely. The thing they say and the thing they feel deep down don't match. So what does the therapist do with that gap? They follow the trail. They get curious about where that deeper image came from, because once you understand where a frightening or distorted picture of death came from, it becomes possible to gently reshape it. You don't argue someone out of a deep image of death. You trace it back to its roots, and in the tracing, it can start to change on its own. Where do the most terrifying images of death come from? The chapter points to a particular set of experiences: feeling erased, shrunken, abandoned, empty, in the dark, falling, or coming apart. These come close to what not existing feels like, and because they're so awful, people usually keep them tightly covered with defenses. They come from 3 places: early attachment, how a baby was held, looked at, and responded to leaves marks that can resurface near death, for better or worse. Relationships, a lifetime of feeling valued or dismissed, held or left, shapes what non-existence feels like inside. And trauma, any kind of overwhelming experience or a mind that never got put together well early on, can lay down these terrible feelings. So when a patient's image of death is full of falling or being abandoned or coming apart, the model invites you to hear it as an echo of something early and deadening, not a literal prediction of what dying will be like, but the leftover trace of how this person's mind was or wasn't held together long ago. And here's the hopeful part, which matters because this is heavy. Not everyone struggles like this, though it's worth staying alert to. The authors are clear that many dying patients, through completely ordinary therapy, work through these struggles. They finish their therapy well, having let go of the fantasy of living forever and settled their fear of death enough to face it without falling apart. They come to accept that life is finite, feel solidly connected to the people they love, and can bear being separate from them. Hold on to those three: facing the end, staying connected, and bearing separateness. If one half of this work is calming the fear of death, the other half is helping the person find real, believable ways to stay connected, ways that make being finite and separate feel less total. And the word real matters there. The whole trouble with the fantasy of living forever is that it isn't true. So the kind of connection we help people find has to be real, not magical. There are three sources. The first is the people we carry inside us, what the chapter calls internal objects, which just means our inner sense of the important people in our lives, including ones who've already died. Therapy helps the patient feel the place those people hold inside them, and that inner company helps them bear being separate and finite. The second is the people still actively in their life, the real present relationships that keep supporting them day to day. As patients do this work, they start to see those relationships as part of how they'll continue their place in the web of life. And the third is legacy, passing on recipes, stories, belongings, lessons, whatever carries meaning. That gives a person real continuity in the face of death. The practical tasks of dying belong here too: a will, estate planning, letters to be opened later, mending a difficult relationship. All of it shapes how the person will live on inside the people they leave behind. This is also where two more structured approaches come in: dignity therapy and meaning-centered psychotherapy. So what are we actually aiming for? The chapter names three understandings that, when they really take hold, change everything. The first is accepting that life is finite, that our time and our abilities run out, and that this is simply true for everyone, not a personal failure or a punishment. The second is that connection continues through the people we carry inside us, that the bond with the people we love lives on internally, even after they're physically gone. And the third is a sense of belonging somewhere in the bigger picture, which brings a particular kind of calm. When those three are working, people feel acceptance, a sense of being whole, and a kind of resilience that holds up even alongside real pain and loss. The benefits flow from there. They live more deliberately, often around love and respect. They feel more at peace inside and with others. Their feelings fit the situation instead of overwhelming them. Decisions get easier and regrets fewer. They feel capable in the role of a dying person. They leave warm, lasting memories. And they invest in the generations coming after them. Notice none of this is about dodging death or numbing it. It's about living the time that's left and the dying itself more fully. Death usually isn't one single event. For most people, it happens piece by piece, and some say it's the dying they fear more than death itself. Early symptoms remind the person death is real. The diagnosis takes away hopes and plans. The illness and treatment bring suffering that touches everything: thinking, feeling, relating, and managing the day. Abilities slip away, and they have to let go of things that gave life meaning. Relationships shift, some people pull away, others move closer, and even after the death, the losses keep coming for those left behind. Every one of those is a loss that has to be grieved. This kind of therapy is built for exactly this: helping people grieve, and in grieving, build new ways of coping. The therapist helps the person make sense of what each loss means, sits with the feeling of it, and opens up what's still possible. Because the losses of dying are never only losses, there's always the chance to find new, realistic hope, even if that hope is just for a peaceful death. Here's how grief helps a person grow and how it goes wrong. When you grieve someone and find you can carry on a role they used to play, in your own way, you've taken them inside. They become a living part of you. The tradition calls that internalizing them. What you can't take inside, you replace through a new relationship, and in reaching for what's missing, you form new connections. So real grief is more than letting go, it's growth, but it can fail. If remembering hurts too much or reaching out backfires, a person can pull away from grieving and sink into a heavy, stuck sadness. From there, they have few ways left to stay connected to anyone. For that person, therapy gently rebuilds the ability to take others inside, starting with the relationship right there in the room. When a person can't find a balance between hope and the fear of dying, it shows up as symptoms, and the most common are anxiety, depression, and a kind of brittleness. Let's talk about anxiety first. When death fear never gets worked through, what the chapter calls unmetabolized, meaning the mind hasn't processed it and made it bearable, it turns into a symptom. What it's really telling you is that the person hasn't found anything real and lasting to feel connected to. Inside, they may feel paralyzed, scattered, cut off from what's real, and very alone. Next is depression. Here it shows up as a person withdrawing into a heavy sadness. Often what's really happened is that a way of coping has stopped working. The patient who always got through life by being a fighter or by managing everything now faces a cancer or an Alzheimer's that has, in a sense, won, and the old strategy fails them. If you can help them find a new way to cope, often through the relationships that still matter to them despite all the limits, the depression can lift. And the third is brittleness, a hard, forced kind of mastery. This is when what a person says doesn't match what they feel underneath. They insist, death has no power over me, I can do anything, I'm not afraid. And the very stiffness of that insistence is the giveaway that there's unresolved fear underneath. One last point that ties these together: anxiety and depression are general signs of distress. They show up in all kinds of situations. And some fear of death is normal, everyone has it. It only becomes a problem when it's left unsettled, with nothing to balance it. Two more symptoms, and these go deeper. Guilt shows up early in our minds and runs through many struggles around death. It takes a few forms: guilt about leaving people who depend on us, the survivor's sense that you caused a loved one's death or failed to save them, people who are hard on themselves seeing death as a punishment they deserve, and at the far end, death imagined as a welcome punishment they actually accept. The roots go way back. Some theories trace guilt to one of the earliest feelings in a baby's mind, guilt about its own anger. The hopeful part is that this therapy is well suited to working with guilt. By understanding both the angry side and the loving, repairing side, it can open up room for compassion and forgiveness instead of just condemnation. And then there's psychic deadness, the deepest state in the chapter. The term sounds abstract, so let me put it plainly. It's a deadness inside, in a person who never really felt alive to anyone, who never had the experience of being truly valued, heard, or treated as worth keeping. The point is sobering. Growth toward peace can't even start if a person has never once felt that kind of mutual, alive connection. These patients arrive carrying raw pain they've never had words for. The work is slow, hard, and asks the therapist to be present enough to actually reach that deadness. As hard as it is, these patients can be deeply motivated, and if the therapist can truly be there with them, growth is possible. Going down into that deadness alongside them, feeling the rawness, may be the first time in their life that part of them has felt connected to another person. The authors use an image I won't forget. It can feel like being the ferryman who crosses the river of the dead and comes back carrying someone brought back to life inside. A person's basic personality shapes how they take the news that they're dying. The clearest example is the narcissistic patient, for whom dying lands as a wound to their self-image. The chapter calls it a narcissistic injury. They may carry a grand sense that nothing, not even death, can touch them, and then, after the diagnosis, collapse into, "How could this happen to me?" with their whole sense of control shattered. Their refusal to accept dying gets in the way of closeness, of gratitude, and even of their family's grieving, because the loved one's attempts to make peace get pushed away. Clinically, if there's enough time, deeper work is worth doing, and sometimes it moves surprisingly fast because the patient feels the clock ticking so powerfully. If there isn't enough time, more practical, behavior-focused counseling may do more good. Match how deep you go to the time you actually have. Second, how do you know therapy is working? It's not a straight line and there's no neat finish line, but there are signs you can recognize. Moments of real change where the patient touches that old deadness again, but this time with you fully present alongside them. The gap closing between what they say about death and what they feel underneath. A more realistic picture of their future. Being able to think about death without either falling apart or going numb. A bigger capacity to love, sometimes even deepened by knowing time is short. More flexibility in how they cope, instead of rigidly shutting down or splitting the world into all good and all bad. More comfort talking about death and sitting with those feelings, and turning toward the real tasks of life's final stretch, like leaving a legacy. That list is also, in a way, your treatment plan in reverse. It tells you what you're guiding the person toward. 5 short cases, all made up, but based on real experiences. First, grief that starts before the death. A 10-year-old boy whose mother had advanced cancer showed, in his drawings, distance from her and anger. The work traced that distance to his guilt about being angry at her for leaving him. Once that was named, inside the safety of the relationship with his parents, he could grieve, and he took both parents inside himself, so that when she died, he held a lasting sense of her love instead of guilt. Second, narcissism similar to the case in the last slide. A woman shaped by her father's self-absorption came in after a breast cancer diagnosis expecting the all-about-me relationship she was used to. The therapist held a gentle limit and offered something steadier. Caring for herself through the cancer became a chance to finally grow into her own person. Third, trauma. A veteran facing a ventilator decision found that hospital smells set off trauma-related panic. Treating the anxiety revealed that his leaning toward refusing the ventilator was about avoiding the trauma, not accepting death. Once that was clear, he chose the ventilator. And later, surrounded by people he loved, chose to come off it at peace. Fourth, the hardest. Suicidality. A young man with a curable cancer refused treatment and tried to pull his therapist into the darkness with real suicide plans. The therapist understood this as that deep inner deadness from never having been kept emotionally alive by his parents. When his pain was named, he started treatment. Then the suicidal feeling slowly lifted. Slow, steady work eased the crisis into acceptance, but based in reality. And fifth, resilience. A Catholic woman in her 80s who had lost 8 children and her husband before here, she still died at peace, blessing each one. She never had therapy. A deep web of love had grounded her. A reminder that this growth can come through life and community, not only through our offices. An important correction so we don't leave the wrong impression. Understanding anxiety and depression as signs of deeper distress does not mean we drop the medication treatment. Real, biological depression and anxiety exist too, and something that starts as an emotional, meaning-based symptom can take on a physical life of its own. Biology and meaning aren't enemies here. So the chapter describes 2 ways to deliver care. One is split treatment. A prescriber handles the medication, keeping an eye on it, including some of the newer options covered elsewhere in the book, while a separate talk therapist does the dynamic work at the same time. The other is integrated care. One clinician who is both the prescriber and the therapist, carrying both roles. For a lot of palliative patients, the best outcome comes from combining medication with talk therapy. As an advanced practice nurse, you might be the prescriber in a split arrangement. Or you might hold both roles yourself. Either way, the principle is the same. Pick the combination that fits the patient, and don't treat medication and psychotherapy as a competition. This is the slide I asked you to hold on to, and it's what makes this chapter different. To help a patient grow toward peace with death, the authors say, you have to know something about your own relationship with death. 3 points. First, it goes both ways. Doing this work stirs up your own awareness of dying just as much as the patient's. Both of you are changed by it. You don't walk away from this work untouched. Second, the closeness goes both ways too. Patients take in your steadiness and your peace with mortality through the same bond that lets a therapy end well. But that same bond means that when a patient dies, the grief and loss land hard on you. And third, bluntly, therapists who do this work all day, surrounded by death constantly, are always at risk of being overwhelmed by it. Having your own therapist or someone to talk it through with isn't a luxury here, it's necessary. If a clinician doing this work isn't examining their own relationship with death, that should be a red flag. And notice how honest the authors are. They're clear you can't wait until you've achieved some perfect peace with death before you start, because that isn't realistic. Even the founders of this field had their own unfinished business with mortality. The point isn't to be perfect, it's to keep working on yourself and to not carry this alone. For those of you who'll do this work, please take that seriously. It protects you and it protects your patients. Let's review the key points. First, psychodynamic thinking gives us a way to understand how people wrestle with death and slowly become more able to bear it. A safe, steady relationship lets them swing back and forth between opposite feelings until they reach a more settled, more bearable acceptance. Second, that process means real grieving and mourning, and for many people, old wounds from early relationships and trauma have to be dealt with first. Work this kind of therapy is built for. Third, the approach can be deep, but it bends to fit the time and energy that seriously ill people and their families actually have, and even children can take part in ways that fit their age. Fourth, when the symptoms ease, less anxiety, less depression, less guilt, less of that inner deadness and brittleness, what's left is a person who feels more whole, sees their future more realistically, can think about death without falling apart or going numb, and can love more fully. Fifth, this care works right alongside medication and psychiatric treatment. Medication administration and psychotherapy are not at odds. And sixth, looking ahead, there's promise in better ways to help with suicide and trauma at the end of life. And a bigger idea, that if whole communities grew more at peace with death, they'd be more resilient. But it all starts close to home. You have to know where you stand with death to help someone else find their footing. What this means is honest self-inquiry, sitting with questions like, what do I actually believe happens when we die? What losses have I lived through, and have I grieved them or worked around them? What about death frightens me most? The pain, the not existing, leaving people, losing control. Where did my beliefs about death come from? Family? Faith? A specific experience? I want to close not on the summary, but on the one thread we've carried the whole way through. Right at the start, I asked you to hold on to something. That this chapter argues you can't help a patient face what you haven't begun to face yourself. We've now seen why. The work of sitting with a dying person doesn't leave the clinician untouched. It stirs your own awareness of mortality every time. That isn't a flaw in the method, it's the method working. The same openness that lets you accompany someone to the most vulnerable part of their mind is the openness that puts you in contact with your own. So the invitation this chapter leaves us with is a personal one. Not to have death figured out, no one does, but to be willing to look at it, to keep looking, and to have your own steady person to do that looking with. That's not a luxury in this work, it's what makes the work safe to do and possible to sustain. We'll carry these ideas forward in the next lecture. For now, sit with this one a moment before you move on to the next thing in your day. Thank you for staying with something difficult. I'll see you in the next lecture.